Senator Reynolds.
Thank you very much, Mr Acting Deputy President. I too rise in reply to the Governor-General's opening address for the 45th Parliament. And after listening to many of my colleagues' address and reply speeches, it just reminds me how lucky and how proud I am to represent this great country of ours in this chamber. The Turnbull government was re-elected on the 2nd of July and is delivering the strong economic plan we took to the Australian people. Last week alone, 26 bills passed our party room and are now working their way through Parliament in delivery of our election commitments for a stronger economy. The priority for the Turnbull government now is rightly to ensure that we have a strong economy, to ensure the safety and security of our nation and repair the budget so that we can deliver what all of us in this place share in common, what we all aspire to. And that is to leave a stronger and more prosperous nation for the next generation of Australians than the one we inherited ourselves. But I believe we are now in danger of leaving the next generation saddled with our own debts. And I've reflected on the Governor-General's remarks in his opening address. And he said this. He said, Australians look to their members and senators to provide them with a parliament that works for them. Australians look to their members and senators to provide them with a parliament that works for them. Possibly to some a statement of the obvious, but one I think that can get lost in the rough and tumble of this place and debates on the issues of the day. The Governor-General further observed that Australian citizens have vested in us, in all of us in this place, their trust to deal sensibly, responsibly and diligently with a multiple of policy choices and issues that confront us. Important not only to how Australians live today, but also to the type of society and the economy that we bequeath to future generations. So, as the Governor-General reminded us, it is up to all of us in this place to provide the leadership to our respective electorates and the Australian community as a whole. For me, and I believe for all of us, one of the most important responsibilities in this place is to preserve the institutions and the principles that underpin our democracy. There is no greater democratic value or individual freedom more greatly valued and oft-cited in the modern Western world than the right to free speech or freedom of expression. It is indeed the foundation of all modern democracies. But it is something that cannot and should not ever be taken for granted. And it's incumbent on all of us in this place to make sure that it is preserved and that in our legislation that it reflects contemporary values and contemporary considerations. Our own unique liberal democratic culture here in Australia recognises that society is improved by individuals thinking for themselves, imparting their own views and then having them contested in open and very robust debate so that good ideas gain traction and bad ideas wither away, enabling changing social norms to be reflected in the legislation of the day. While freedom of speech is never, ever completely free in any democracy, history shows us that freedoms are not successfully preserved through legislative or in-practice censorship of deeply held opinions or beliefs. It is very clear to me that in all democracies, free speech is essential to preserve and protect the rights of minorities. Freedom of speech is essential to preserve and protect the rights of minorities. The wonderful thing about our own unique form of representative democracy here in Australia, indeed particularly for senators on this side of the chamber, is that we can pursue topics we feel very passionately about without fear of repercussion, and we have in our very broad church the freedom to express our own personal views. It's our job, and it's the expectation of the very people who elected us to represent them. Despite some opinions to the contrary, Australia does not have a Bill of Rights. Therefore, it is our role as parliamentarians to make, review and amend legislation to ensure that it is responsive and reflective of the will of the electorate. Our own constitutional founding fathers deliberately did not codify in any founding document of our nation individual freedom, rights and liberties. Rather, after a considerable degree of debate and discussion, they determined that societal values, norms and opinions, they change over time, and once codified, were difficult, if not impossible, to transform with changing views and opinions of society. Our founding fathers had great faith that the Australian people would ensure that laws and judgments represented the majority of community expectations and beliefs of the day. That, I believe, is our role here today. As elected representatives in this place, we are the guardians of free speech in this nation. It is a constant balancing act in all democracies, but a balance that must be constantly challenged and constantly tested. And the only way to do that is to allow for free debate and free discussions on issues of the day, and it can never be taken for granted. Our greatest Prime Minister, Sir Robert Menzies, explained in a University of Virginia lecture in 1967 why Australia does not have a Bill of Rights. He said, far more eloquently than I ever could, he said that responsible government in a democracy is regarded by us as the ultimate guarantee of justice and individual rights. I'll say that again. He said that responsible government in a democracy is regarded by us as the ultimate guarantee of justice and individual rights. He's talking about all of us in this chamber and in the other place. We are the guardians of justice and individual rights in this nation. I'm glad that the draftsmen of the Australian Constitution made little or no attempt to codify what individual liberties are. As today, we would have had either in the Constitution or a similar Bill of Rights that codified the values of Australian society in 1901. Our founding fathers also knew that with legal definition, words can become more important than the ideas they are seeking to capture. And as I've said, that the values and societal norms change over time. They also knew that to define human rights is to either to limit them, for in the long run, words have to be given some meaning and have some judgment about the meaning of the words, or if they are expressed so broadly that the discipline which is inherent in all governments and ordered societies become difficult, if not impossible. So for all of us who exercise freedom of speech and freedom of opinion, and there's a lot of that goes on in this chamber regularly, but be it in public life or in the media, all of us have to accept that others are likely to be vehemently in a disagreement with what we say, but also that others may be offended or insulted by what we have to say. But that is a healthy thing in any democracy and is critically important to make sure that our standards maintain what is acceptable to the Australian community. Noam Chomsky noted that Goebbels was in favour of free speech for the views that he liked. So was Stalin. If you're really in favour of free speech, then you're in favour of freedom of speech for precisely the views that you abhor. Otherwise, you are simply not in favour of free speech. My own experience over many years in politics is that many, and particularly I think on the left, endlessly espouse tolerance and compassion with a fervour that leads me to truly believe that they are the single moral compass of our nation. I mean, how insulting is that? In our democracy, they certainly have the right to that opinion. But for me, here is the rub. While many on the left in public life and in the media are endlessly and stridently compassionate for and tolerant of those who reaffirm their own personal truths and morals, they are equally ruthlessly intolerant of those who do not share their own beliefs. Anyone who dares to question their own unshakable beliefs are dismissed as ignorant. Worse, in public life today, they're labelled as sceptics, and there is an attempt to hound them into silence to ensure that the public hears and believes in only one truth, that is their own. All this does is suppress and generate frustrations in the many whose voices have been silenced, leading to the very reactions that those seeking to suppress their point of view are seeking to avoid. 2 years ago, I spoke in this place about my concerns with Section 18C as an example of a counterproductive legislative restriction on the freedom of speech and expression. The changes to the Racial Discrimination Act that have been the subject of much discussion and debate is to remove the words offend and insult from Section 18C. These are words which hurt feelings, not humiliate or intimidate, of which I think we are all in agreement should stay. In its current form, I do not believe that Section 18C strikes the right balance between freedom of speech and the prevention of racial discrimination. I greatly appreciate the comments made in this place throughout the course of this debate, and particularly those of Senator Moore and also Senator Dodson in his fabulous first speech. Both of them reminded us of our shared humanity, what limitations are acceptable to the Australian community, and, as Senator Dodson reminded us, that standards and social norms change over time. So when reviewing any legislation, the intent and the context is always critically important. It's my understanding that when the Act was passed in 1975, the original intention was to prohibit racial discrimination in accordance with the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. However, subsequent amendments have extended its reach to the point where many, including myself, believe it has created a serious imbalance between its intentions and its practical application. And to me, the recent and very much publicised QUT case demonstrates that 18C has gone a step too far. I believe that removing the words offend and insult and leaving the words humiliate and intimidate strike the right balance and restores clarity and precision to the Act. Hurt feelings shouldn't have legal recourse. During the course of this debate, many prominent Australians outside of this place, from all sides of the political spectrum, have lent their support to removing the words offend and insult from the Act. Mr Paul Howes is somebody who I perhaps wouldn't be normally quoting in support of my argument in this place, but Paul Howes, the former National Secretary of the AWU, summed it up, I think, very eloquently when he said, "I am concerned that people in some circles I mix with, on my side of politics, increasingly seem to think that they should write or invoke or resurrect laws that will shut Andrew Bolt up." That is not freedom of speech, and that is a step too far. Warren Mundine, the head of the Prime Minister's Indigenous Advisory Council, last week expressed support for removing offend and insult, stating that "I do believe it needs changing, not to wipe it out completely, but to pull it back a bit." And also, while senators on this side of the chamber may not regularly turn to Julian Burnside for inspiration, on this topic I find his opinion very instructive. So Julian Burnside himself stated that the mere fact that you insult or offend somebody probably should not, of itself, give rise to legal liability. My personal view, that is of Julian Burnside's, that 18C probably reached a bit too far, so some fine-tuning would probably be okay. Indeed, the Australian Law Reform Commission itself concluded last year, and I'll read it out because, again, it's very instructive in this debate. This is the Law Reform Commission itself. "There are arguments that 18C lacks sufficient precision and clarity and unjustifiably interferes with freedom of speech by extending to speech that is reasonably likely to offend. In some respects, the provision is broader than is required under international law to prohibit the advocacy of racial hatred, broader than similar laws in other jurisdictions, and may be susceptible to constitutional challenge." In comparing Australia's Section 18C with other common law countries, the Australian Law Commission also found that the New Zealand and UK provisions seem narrower than the Australian provision. For example, the provisions do not cover offensiveness and do not require that the person provokes hostility or hatred against a group of persons defined by race or ethnicity. In fact, the diversity of views previously held within the Human Rights Commission itself reflect the wide range of opinions in the community on this issue. And therefore I believe this discussion, while it's been over 2 years in the making here in this chamber. It has a long way to go in the Australian community, as it should. But freedom of speech isn't just about academic interpretation or legal interpretation or judicial interpretation. I think it goes further than that, and I think it touches on elements that actually make us Australian. The journalist David Marr said, "The present Act has been changed. The present Act has to be changed a little. Hurt feelings should never attract the law as they do now under Section 18C. He went on to touch onto an important point, saying that offences and insults are the everyday reality of free discourse here in Australia. And David Marr's comments that offence and insults are the everyday reality of free discourse in a democracy made me reflect on my Uncle Bruce Reynolds. He was a true Aussie larrikin from Marble Bar in Western Australia. He was the sort of bloke who would get up in the morning and 10 o'clock, have a bit of a flagon over his shoulder. He would welcome people with open arms. He lived out of his trailer, which was an old trailer with wardrobes, which made up the walls of his house. And I have absolutely no doubt that some would have found his language offensive and certainly occasionally insulting. But most of us who knew him would have seen the mischievous smile and the twinkle in his eye as he took the piss out of people. And I think it would be a tragedy for all Australians if, in the name of political correctness and for the fear of hurting someone's feelings, that great sense of Australian larrikinism and, as I said, taking the piss out of people would be lost. Our founding fathers, I believe, would have been so proud that we can simultaneously debate in this place issues that are fundamental to the health of our democracy, in this case freedom of expression, while at the same time the government of the day gets on with what it is elected to do. I believe this is a cause for great celebration in here and in our nation, and not one for criticism and derision. Thank you very much, Madam Acting Deputy.